Hey, it's Jared. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to get sharp images every time with any camera. The camera I'll be using in this video as an example is a Sony camera, but this feature is available on pretty much every camera that's out there. Now, one of the challenges that comes from trying to get sharp images is making sure that your subject is selected by the camera as the point of interest. When you press down that shutter button and your camera starts to focus, it's trying to figure out what exactly you want to focus on. And a lot of times, especially with these newer cameras, it does a great job of figuring that out. With subject detection and even eye tracking autofocus, you're able to press down the shutter and the camera will accurately identify, track, and follow that subject. But not all the time does it get it right. And especially if you have a camera that's a little bit older, that camera may struggle significantly at getting that subject in focus, or even deciding which subject to choose. So there's a feature that pretty much all cameras have that allow you to minimize your camera's ability to look at that entire scene and potentially get confused. And I've been using this feature for a long time because in all the different scenarios that I find myself in as a photographer, a lot of things could be taking place in the background. And sometimes the camera can decide that that background subject is more interesting than the foreground subject. And the object in the foreground is the one that you want in focus. And when you miss that focus, it's frustrating because you miss that shot that you wanted to capture. The subject is blurry, out of focus, and you end up having to delete that image. So how do you minimize the opportunity for your camera to miss that subject? Well, there's two settings that you really need to look at. First of all, we're going to make sure that we have the right focus mode turned on. On this particular camera, there are several different types of focus modes, and most cameras are going to have different focus modes like this. Now, what you're seeing is a single shot autofocus, which means when you push down the shutter button, the camera is going to achieve focus on something, and once it achieves focus, it's not going to dance around and try and modify that focus. As that subject moves, it's not going to continuously autofocus. It is a single point autofocus. So just to give you an example here, when I press down on this shutter button here, and it achieves focus, which it has achieved focus, and then I move my camera down maybe to this lens cap right here, it's not continuously autofocusing. It just stayed where it was at. It's not going to adjust the autofocus. And so that could be good in instances where you're taking pictures of something that's not moving. You press down that shutter button and hold it, and your camera focuses on that, and it is not going to be distracted by anything else. Now, if we go into our automatic focus mode, the camera is going to choose what to do based on the scenario. So if I press down the shutter button here and then move down, it's not adjusting focus. It's deciding single point autofocus because nothing is really moving through the scene. I'm moving the camera itself, but nothing is moving through the scene. Now with continual autofocus, if I press down the shutter, you can see the box changes and it's trying to stay locked on to the subject because it's using tracking to lock down and stay on that subject. So even if I move the camera down and maybe try and reposition things down here, it's still trying to find and stay tracked on whatever that was. This is the best option for things that are moving. Now, this example of me just trying to focus on the Sony cap here and something in the background is not the best example to give you, but continuous autofocus is great for things that are moving, and single point autofocus is great for things that are not moving where you don't want your camera to get distracted. So knowing which focus mode to use for which scenario is the first step. To be honest with you, unless I'm shooting things that are moving fast, I stay in automatic autofocus. I let the camera decide what to do based on what's going on in the scene. And when I'm shooting things that are fast, I go into continuous mode, and that's about it. But how do we prevent the camera from choosing the wrong thing in the scene? Well, you'll see that I have this little box here, and this little box means that I am changing the area in which my camera can decide to focus from. Now, most cameras from the factory are going to come set to something like a wide area autofocus. And what that means is it's going to use as much of the sensor area as your camera can to find an autofocus point, and the camera is going to choose. So when I push down the shutter button, it's choosing something right in the middle. And the last time I pressed down the shutter button, it decided to choose the small stack of boxes. And so things can change depending on where you move your camera. And that's allowing your camera to make the choice of what should be in focus. And sometimes your camera is going to get it right, and sometimes it might get it wrong. And so in this wide area focus mode, you're really hoping that your camera detects the subject and stays tracked on that subject. The newer the camera that you have, the better your camera is going to be at that. As the technology advances, cameras get better at detecting the right subject and staying locked onto that subject. But just because it's a newer camera doesn't mean that it is infallible. A lot of times our cameras will detect something in the background because maybe the thing in the foreground isn't moving, but something in the background is moving. So the camera decides to attach to something in the background when really you were just waiting for the thing in the foreground to start to move. So I limit that by going into my focus area and going past zone and past center fix and going down to spot. Now, before spot, let's talk about the other two. Zone autofocus is not a wide autofocus, so it doesn't utilize the entire sensor. It breaks it up into zones. You can see that there are 9 zones here in which the camera can choose autofocus. And so it can choose and dance around whether to use multiple zones or just to select something small in the center. And so it's choosing essentially in the same way that it did from wide, but with a smaller area. And then if we go into center fix, you can see it's essentially a box just in the middle, and it is going to be a center fixed focal point. And so it's only going to choose from the center, and there's no way to move that box around. That box is fixed in the center. I never use this focal point because it doesn't allow me to move the box around. But if I go down to spot, and you can see we have small, medium, and large spot, it gives me a box that I can move around and position anywhere on the screen. But on this particular camera, I don't have to move the box around like that. I can actually tap and move the box around as well. And that also enables tracking. And so if I want to tap on a subject and then allow the camera to track, notice how I tapped on an item and that camera, as I move it around now, is staying fixed and the box is moving around. And so this single point, what it does is it limits the camera's ability to choose. It makes it choose only from what's within the box. And so I can place this box on my subject. If I know that my subject is not moving, like take for example, this scene, you're looking at me and I'm someone who's not really moving. It's like, yeah, I'm moving my hands or whatever, but my face is staying pretty much in the same area. The camera that I'm looking into right now has a box that's on my face. And so if I move back, and as long as I keep my head relatively where the box is, I'm going to stay in focus. And then as I move closer, autofocus will continue to keep me in focus. Of course, if I move outside of the scene, the camera starts to search around because that box is looking just in one spot and it detected that I'm not there. So it's looking to find something else to put into focus. So what that box does is it limits the ability for the camera to get distracted. And that's the problem that results in us missing shots. It's not necessarily because of a camera setting we were using or something like that. It's simply our camera trying to make the best decision that it can, but having too much information and it doesn't know what to do with it, and it chooses the wrong subject. Our cameras can't read our mind, and so it's just doing its best. And often because we give our camera too much freedom, it ends up missing the shot. So I find that the selective point autofocus, and all cameras have this, some of them just operate in different ways. On Canon and Nikon, some of those can be really small points or can be areas with specific amounts of points. But on most cameras, you have this ability to maneuver this point around and move it and position it to wherever you know your subject is going to be. And this works really great, especially for situations where your subject is not going to be moving around a lot, or you know that you're going to be able to keep your subject positioned within that box. And so I find myself using this pretty much all the time because I know that I can position my subject exactly where that box is. I can move the box around as needed just by toggling it around with the back of the camera, or I can tap on that subject and then tracking will do the hard work for me. And that's definitely a feature of newer cameras, is having this really good tracking. So the reason that you're probably not getting tack sharp images all the time is because your camera decides to focus somewhere else. It may even decide to focus, if you're taking a picture of a person, on their ear or something else other than their face. And so while the photo is not totally out of focus, it's soft. And you want to make sure that with that spot, that box that you're using, you position that on the subject's eye because we want the eyes to be in focus the most. But positioning that box over your subject is going to eliminate your camera's opportunity to focus on something in the background, thus preventing you from missing the shot that you wanted. So besides composing your shot and making sure everything's lined up and making sure your camera settings are correct and everything's good, now you have to think about this box that needs to go over your subject. But I consider proper focus more important than the camera settings. I mostly shoot in manual mode, but I would rather shoot in shutter or aperture priority and have my focus point set than shoot in manual mode and miss focus. So I highly recommend you spending some time practicing. Try shooting with this and seeing the difference, especially if you're shooting portraits where it's super important for your subject to be as sharp as possible, or you're shooting sports where a lot of things are happening in the background and you find your camera missing your subject quite often. Try shooting with a smaller focus point and positioning your subject in the box so that way you don't miss opportunities by accidentally focusing on something in the background. So I hope this video helped. This really does come down to practice, and it's something that I go through in much more detail, as well as many other camera settings in my photography fundamentals course, which you can check out. There's a link in the description below. But I also have a free newsletter, the Shutter Society newsletter, that is weekly, and I include tips and tricks, news, and other things that I find interesting that are photography related, because I can't put everything in a video. So definitely check out that newsletter, which is linked in the description below. The best thing you can do with this new information is get out there and try it. And the more time you spend behind your camera, the better you're going to get at using this smaller point autofocus, which is going to help you get tack sharp images every time, regardless of what camera you're using. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you back in the next one.